She's a professor of religious studies in Norway, the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, Norwegian University of Science and Technology. As a matter of fact, she has lots of books and articles written. She got a long way from Norway to our center, accepted our invitation, and I'm positive that you will enjoy because she is very informative, knowledgeable about the topic, and she's interested in exchanging ideas. So maybe she will talk about 1 hour, maybe 50 minutes or 1 hour, and then we will have the floor and we will talk. If there are questions, we will raise, or comments, or whatever. And thank you for your, as a matter of fact, attending our seminar, and I hope we will see you also in the next seminars in ICC. So I invite Professor Ulrika Martensson to take a seat and
well, thank you. It is me really who should thank you for the very kind invitation, and you have now raised expectations very high, and I'm not sure whether I will be able to live up to this in terms of being knowledgeable of religion. So even though I'm not a political scientist, I'm still interested in what religion means in terms of political issues. And being a comparativist, I have an interest for universalism. What is there in common? And so I started my PhD studies, and then my focus was on Tabari. Tabari was a very, very famous Islamic scholar. He died in 923 Common Era, and was born in the region of Iran which is called Tabaristan by the Caspian Sea, today Mazandaran, I think, yes. But then eventually moved to Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate, and he there worked as a scholar within fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence, and theology, hadith science, Quran science and commentary, and history. So he was very broadly educated, and he also served with the state administration, not employed, but he consulted them on legal issues, particularly, and consulted with the wazirs, or what could we say, the interior ministers. Yes. So when I worked on his history, then I found out that the researchers who studied his history before me, they say that his history is mainly about religious issues. It's about God and how God governs history, and that, you know, man somehow is only a tool in the hands of God. But then I had a different theory. The title of his history is in Arabic, Ta'rikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, which is the history of the messengers or prophets and the kings. So he's clearly interested in the relationship between messengers and kings, or religion and state. And I started exploring his history, and I saw that it was primarily actually concerned with imperial administration. So, and a sort of social contract theory. And this was, I saw that the social contract theory in his history were connected to two key Quranic concepts: mithaq, which is usually translated in English as covenant, and kitab, which we usually translate as book or scripture, but it's clear from Tabari's history that it implies not just the written, it refers to written contracts, in fact. Kitab is not just a book, but it's the principle of writing as such. These two are conflated meanings. So, and the main point with all this is that in Tabari's history, which starts with creation and runs until the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate in the year 915, he goes through all of the known political history, which in his case starts with the Persian empires, then goes through the biblical history, the Israelites and their kingdoms, then he moves on to Arab kingdoms, and then the later Persian dynasties, the Sassanid Empire and so on, and then Islam comes, the Prophet Muhammad and his state, and then the Islamic Caliphates. So, in fact, what he does, he says that God established with creation the mithaq, the covenant. But then the covenant, he immediately leads it on to the first Persian kings. And then he describes the implementation of mithaq as the ruler's social contract. And the principle of the social contract is that law must be written, and that each person who commits to a written contract is bound by it, even the ruler. This is very important. It's actually most of all about the fact that the king is bound by a social contract, which in turn implies that all legal contracts are written. And this, as we know, is a very important principle in modern rule of law theory, that the law must be written so that it's accessible and you can hold people responsible to the law. It's known to everyone. So this is the basic principle of Tabari's history, is this. And then he analyzes imperial administration from the first ancient Persian kingships through to Islam and the caliphates. According to this principle, do the rulers uphold this social contract of written law under which they are themselves subject to the law? Or do they raise above the law and, let's say, start to arbitrarily govern? And do they also then leave the principle of written contracts? And his point here is, it's quite complicated. I won't go into details because it also has to do with taxation systems and other things. But his main point is here that when the state administration leaves the principle of written contracts, the state administration becomes corrupt, you get problems with families, group loyalties, and you get a problem of redistribution of revenue within the state and in relation to the general population, the peasants and the other important social groups. And he's then, my point here with reference to Islam is that, as I said, these principles, mithaq and kitab, we know them from the Quran. But Tabari generalizes these principles and says, okay, God established them with creation, but in history of man and states, they predate Islam. So he connects them to the Persian kingship and then analyzes each and every king and ruler according to this measure. And then he says, as a historian, the rise of the Prophet Muhammad and Islam was caused by the fact that the Sasanian Shah, Khosrau Parvez, he violated his contract with the Arab vassal king of Lachem. And for that reason, the Arabs were, let's say, they were the violated party. Their contract had been broken by the Persian king. So therefore, his contract was not valid anymore, and this caused the Arab conquests of the Persian Empire and the rise of the Islamic states. And it's connected then to the message of the Quran also. So my point is here that At-Tabari saw the Islamic Quranic message and certain key Quranic concepts as expressions of a social contract theory. But the main principle here is that the message about these principles speaks to the individual conscience. It is a very individual-oriented ethics, because the idea is that each individual is obliged to obey these contracts. That is the main thing. Whether it's the king or a peasant, it doesn't matter. Everyone has the same obligations. So it's about individual conscience and also about the necessity of clearly defining in law the rights and duties of the rulers and the subjects, and then sticking to these and negotiating around these agreed upon terms. And the Quran is very interesting because I said he uses this concept, kitab, in two ways. Both to refer to the principle of written contracts, but it also, of course, refers to the Quran as a scripture, a religious scripture. And then, so Tabari says specifically that the Quran is kitab munzal, so writing which is sent down from God. But its function is to persuade. It's balagha. So the nature of the Quran is persuasive argumentation about the need for people, individuals, to hold the mithaq with God, and through that to hold their legal contracts and obligations in society. So that's how he actually describes and analyzes his Islam and the Quran, which is in one way a divine explanation, but it's also a very historical analysis, and he uses it to evaluate imperial administration, whether it worked or not. And when it doesn't work is when you violate the contract, and it works when you stick to these contract rules, basically. So, in that sense, it's very clear that he implied that, of course, Islam and the Quran is very much about governance and government and states and state administration. But that's only one part of it, because the really key thing is the individual conscience and the individual obligation to the contract. So there is no conflict between seeing something as a social or governmental state-oriented message and as a very individual obligation, the two of the same coin, so to speak. Now, the question is then, is there a link between all this and the Nordic context? And I think there is, and we can discuss afterwards whether I'm making this up or reading too much into Tabari and vice versa, but I will try to explain to you that I do see this whole the focus on an individual and his or her contractual obligations as something which is very key to the Nordic welfare state model. So we'll get to that eventually, but I'll then try to explain how did I get to study Islam in the Nordic context. And this is, I was initially totally occupied with my historical studies, and I still am to a large extent, but I live and work in Norway, and I have a very good colleague in the USA, Martensson, who has a journal, and he then wanted a special journal issue about Islam in the Nordic countries, and he said, "Can't you do that?" So I said, "Oof, that's going to be a lot of work, but yes, I will do that if you allow me to invite in also other colleagues, because otherwise it will take a long time." But the end result was that I and 9 other colleagues, we produced a special issue called Public Islam and the Nordic Welfare State, Changing Realities, ? And this one is to be published, I think, soon, in a couple of months or something. And when it comes to research on Islam and Muslims in the Nordic context, there is this research debate that is very much about that some scholars argue that what we're witnessing actually more or less since the Iranian Revolution in 1979 is this major resurgence of religion into politics and into states worldwide, including in the Nordic countries. I exaggerate slightly, but not so much, so that a lot of researchers are saying that even though Scandinavia, the Nordic countries, are very, very secularized, still we are witnessing even here a kind of return of religion to the public debates, the public sphere, and the desecularization of politics and society. And there are some of my colleagues contributing to this special issue who argue this thesis. I am much more skeptical. I don't quite see this in the Nordic context, and I'll explain why. What we did, and I should also say that when people say that there is a resurgence of religion in the public and desecularization in the Nordic countries, it has got to do with Islam and the arrival of Muslims. It's very much focused on that. So what we did was to go out and look at how is Islam and Muslims, how are they doing within the Nordic welfare state and its public institutions, schools, prisons, their values in politics, etc. So look at it in that way and try to see whether we see this enormous impact of religion and Islam on the Nordic public institutions. And when I started to do this research is when I had to explain what is the Nordic welfare state actually about. Because there are many welfare state models in the world. So according to the political scientists, there are 3 main categories. There is the Anglo-American model, there is the continental European model, and then there is the Nordic model. And then they would say that in the Anglo-American model, the state has very little responsibility for the individual's welfare. There is a basic, very low minimum support mechanism, but essentially the individual is supposed to sort of make it on his or her own, develop his or her capacities, etc. That is not really the responsibility of the state. In the continental model, a lot of authority or influence is given to collective, like cooperative bodies such as unions, churches, and other civil society. That is also the case in the Anglo-American model, but it's more slightly different. But then the Nordic model stands out in the fact that it's based on a contract between the state and the individuals, where the state is responsible for the individuals' possibilities to develop themselves fully through education, professional life. It is not the family that's responsible. It's not your labor union or your church or other religious organization. It's the state. And the state mustn't control what you do with the resources you get. You choose where you want to go with your tax resources, let's say. But this is the essential social contract in the Nordic welfare state. So we want to see then how is this working for Muslims in the Nordic institutions. And I will tell you now about my experiences in Norway, and specifically in my city, Trondheim. So, of the Nordic countries, which are Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Iceland, but Iceland wasn't part of our study, then I'd say Sweden has the largest numbers of Muslim migrants, I think, and people of Muslim background. So about 5% or something of the population in Sweden, I think. Denmark, slightly below, not that much. Finland is only about 1 or 2% or something. And Norway is about 3% of the population are Muslims. Finland is in many ways an interesting case because they have an old Muslim community, the Tatars, who in Finland's case have been there since the early 1800s. But otherwise, one could say that larger scale presence of Muslims in the Nordic countries come through migration, work migration, asylum seekers, but starting from the late 60s, early 70s, basically. So we have now 3 generations, if we use these terms, of Muslims in the Nordic countries. In Norway, which I will focus on now, the capital in Norway is Oslo, and that's where the majority live of Norway's Muslim population, where the largest group is from Pakistan. They're the ones who came first. We have all the major Pakistani schools, the Deobandi, the Barelwi, other movements like Tablighi, Jamaat Islami. There is basically quite a good representation of Pakistani Muslim cultures and schools in Oslo. But then there are also many, there are a group, substantial but not that big, but still a group of Iranians. There are many Iraqis, especially since the war in Iraq, many have come. There are quite a large group of Afghans. There's a large group of Somalis, also recent migrants. So gradually the Norwegian Muslim population is becoming more and more multinational. And we see then, of course, the institutionalization of Islam is going on in the same time. So not just the Pakistanis, but we get also the other typical law schools and movements, Muslim Brotherhood representation, a few so-called Salafis, but also typical Somali Shafi'i mosques, and the Turks have their Diyanet state-organized mosques also. So basically the core Islamic institutions have been successfully established in Norway, one could say. And also in my city then, Trondheim, which is Norway's third largest city, the population is about 200,000 roughly people, and I think of those around 3% would be Muslims, much like the national average. But the Muslims in Trondheim have come very recently, so it's only the last few decades. So most of them are what social scientists would call first generation immigrants and their children. So when we talk about how Muslims are being incorporated into public institutions in Norway and Trondheim, I would really say that it is not at all a question of desecularization of the public institutions. I don't even see that there is a real resurgence of religion in the public sphere, but except that the non-Muslims are discussing Islam to a very, very large extent. But there is not a big, substantial Muslim presence in any way in the public debates. A few voices here and there, but nothing outside of, let's say, the ordinary that would warrant any theories about major resurgence of religion. What there is a public worry about religion, is what I see. So I think in the case of Norway, what one should say is that this country has been, still has a Lutheran state church. It is being dismantled, so it will turn into an autonomous folk church in 10 years' time or so, but it is still a state church. But the population is becoming increasingly secular, and the trend in all the Nordic countries, I think, at the level of the general population, is actually increasing secular values. And the states are becoming increasingly secularized. Sweden disassociated its state church in 2000. Denmark has a folk church, but it is also moving in that direction. Norway is disestablishing its state church. So if anything, the Nordic countries are becoming more secular. But the public is more worried about religion precisely for that reason, because they are becoming more secular. So they talk about religion a lot more than they did before. And this is provoked by the presence of Islam and Muslims. But it does not mean that things have become desecularized, if you follow my argument here, because I think it's important, because this argument that religion is coming back big time is always, can be used also to really say that Islam is a kind of problematic challenge to society. So what I see is rather a human rights challenge that the presence of Muslims poses to the public institutions. Now, in order to explain this, we need to look at quickly the European Union level, because the European Union is very important for social policy in the Nordic countries, even though it doesn't force members to adhere to certain social policy. It sets guidelines which the member states like Sweden and Finland and Denmark follow, and even non-members like Norway very closely align themselves with EU policy. And when it comes to what we could call integration of cultural minorities, and especially Muslims, the EU has since the 1990s been concerned with research that shows that the European Muslims are not as well integrated into society as the European politicians would want them to be. Meaning that on the labor market they are more marginalized than the general populations, lower wages, a little bit. In political participation, European Muslims have been shown not to be active and present as much as the politicians would want them to be, again compared with the general population. And there is documented discrimination when it comes to hiring processes, employment and housing market, for example. So, given this situation in the 90s, the European Union policymakers launched a strong initiative, the Dialogue Initiative, that the majority public institutions are obliged to accommodate minorities' cultural and religious needs in order to make it possible for them to be included into labor market politics and so on to a larger extent. So the European Union defines integration as a two-way process where the majority and the minorities adapt to each other. And this is very often ignored in public debates about integration, where it is the minorities who you have to adjust because you're the minority. But this is not what the European Union policy guidelines says. They say there must be mutual accommodation, but they frame this accommodation within the human rights. So no accommodation that goes outside of human rights. If you say, for example, that I would want to forbid my son to change religion, for example. No, we cannot accommodate that because that violates freedom of religion, for example. So, human rights, they define the accommodation. Yet, the human rights are quite radical when it comes to economic rights. They say that people have right to basically equality in economic aspects. They have the right to self-realization in economic, social, cultural and political terms. Also, the freedom of the religion paragraph in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is very far-going. It says you have the right to manifest your religion in public and in private. Not just to believe, but to manifest and practice publicly and privately. And then, of course, there are all sorts of ways in which countries try to circumvent this, and we can discuss that when I'm finished. But essentially, a human rights framework doesn't have to be a straitjacket. It can also open up a lot of possibilities for religious minorities and other cultural minorities, and that's what it should do. Now, in the Norwegian context, my personal research was to go and look at the dialogues in my city, Trondheim, that had been carried out between, on the one hand, the church and Muslim organizations, and on the other hand, public institutions and Muslims. So the most important and interesting one is the church and Islam dialogue. Norway institutionalized a national interfaith dialogue in 1993 between the Church of Norway, the state church, and the National Islamic Council. And they then stuck to the European Union policy that human rights are the framework for the dialogue. So they have produced a series of public statements where both parties subscribe to freedom of religion and freedom from religion. So both the Church and the Islamic Council. And there are declarations against violence in close relations and against religious extremism and several others. But the interesting thing with these declarations is that the Church does not assume to know human rights any better than their Muslim dialogue partners. And this is very important because Norway nationally has a kind of new policy of identifying as a nation with human rights. And so they go, our national culture is human rights values, and we export human rights, and we represent human rights internally, and so on. So in the general public debate, the sentiment is very much that we Norwegians know about human rights, but the immigrants, and especially the Muslims, don't know about human rights, but we can teach them through various, through integration, through teaching, through dialogue, etc. But the interfaith dialogue between the Church and the Islamic Council has not at all adopted this kind of approach. The Church says that we're all challenged by human rights. We Christians from Norway, we are challenged by the, let's say, the advent of Muslims to Norway. And we know that we are not necessarily prepared to grant the rights to other people because we don't see when we violate these rights, possibly. So they have established this discourse in the dialogue where they start from the point of view that both are equally challenged here. And it's in the meeting, in the daily practices of getting on together that you can really implement human rights. Talk about it is not the point. So it's in the daily practice. And this also means that the Church, as far as I can see, the Church has achieved a kind of universalist language. That's what they managed. The Church and the Islamic Council together have actually created a universal language around human rights, where they also, doesn't mean that they deny their differences or try to become the same, not at all. They all have, they go into Islamic fiqh when that, or jurisprudence when that's necessary, and they discuss the Trinity and the Christian theological specificity. So it's not that they try to sort of say that everyone is the same, but they still have a universal language about the possibility of having shared values, which are not necessarily the one or the other, but it's actually human rights-based values. These are not a property of the Christian Norwegians or the Muslims, but it's a universal sort of language when it comes to rights and duties that you can reach consensus around. Now, in the public institutions, it hasn't been as easy. And I looked specifically at the child care authorities in Trondheim. Child care authorities in the Nordic countries, as many of you know, the child care authorities have a great mandate in an authority in relation to families, because they can intervene and take custody of children when they find that a family is dysfunctional for various reasons. And to many of the new migrants in Trondheim, this is a trauma. The mere knowledge that a state institution can actually intervene in the family and take away your child has caused a lot of trauma. And also, an additional complexity is that in the Norwegian context, they do not have a practice of Muslim foster families. So when Muslim children were taken into custody, they were placed in non-Muslim families, and sometimes at great distance from the biological family. So all this was very inflamed and sore and traumatic relationship for many of Trondheim's Muslim migrants, especially the newly arrived. No successful dialogue was established, and it seems to me that the child care authorities, they had studied a lot of anthropological research, and they had probably quite viable model for how Muslim families work, which may create problems with children. And this is that Muslim families, when the child becomes a teenager, tend to want to control the child. And that this is a problem, and that the authorities, on the other hand, and Norwegian culture represents the children's rights. And in some cases, this is certainly true. This may very well be true, that the family is trying to control the child. But the problem is, with that kind of approach, with all the well-meaning in the world, they could not reach any working communication with their Muslim clients. And all they managed to do when they tried to have dialogue was to create more aggression and resentment. What happened in the end was that the church in the town intervened and managed to get a public hearing where the child care authorities had a meeting with the mosques, but also all other cultural minorities who had similar experiences of the child care authorities. And then, in the proceedings afterwards, they managed to find common grounds and a new way of collaborating, which involved then finding Muslim foster families for Muslim foster children. And they involved the mosque in finding and educating families for that purpose. And now, one could say that, okay, for the child care authorities to suddenly start caring about finding religiously defined foster families is a kind of desecularization or something, but it isn't. It's actually only about implementing human rights. It's the parents' rights to raise a child according to their customs, which is part of the human rights treaties. So the only thing that's actually happened is that this Norwegian public institution, through engaging with Muslims, through finding also a kind of agreement where they could agree about common principles, that, okay, we need to secure the child's rights here, but it doesn't mean that you are controlling, we are the ones who know about rights and etc. But to reach this common problem definition and find a solution that was possible for the parents to accept. The only thing that happened is that human rights have been advanced and implemented in practice. But it is not, as I see it, de-secularization in any sense that Islam has imposed itself on Norwegian public institutions. And I still find that an important distinction. But it so I think if I'm to wrap up my talk, I think my experience, both of my own research of Islamic history and Tabari and the Quran, and my fieldwork in the context of public institutions, shows that it's not to say that there aren't differences, but that the search for a kind of universal language to explain things is really important, because, like, it's hard to understand otherwise. So I'll stop there, and then I think still that actually if one, so universalism has also something to say about this very complex relationship between religion and culture on the one hand, and similarities and difference, because it seems to me that the religion in the Norwegian context has been, the interfaith religious dialogue is the one that has managed to bring out the universal language, whereas the public institutions who are very much concerned with culture, and they try to define cultural differences, and they use anthropological research about differences. And I'm not saying that differences don't exist, but it's created problems in the communication to simply focus on cultural difference. That's my key argument, and thank you.
You're welcome.